Education and Workforce Task Force and Advantage Kansas. And we will be inviting them over the next several weeks to share their thoughts as we go forward. So again, I want to welcome all of you. So excited. I'm glad we're using Zoom so we can cut your travel time and hopefully let you enjoy more time at home. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to the chair of this committee, Jim McNeese. Jim, for those of you that don't know, because he'll be award-winning high school principal, not only in Kansas, but in other states. But he has been a principal in small school districts, high school principal. He's been in some of the largest schools in Kansas. He's been in both private systems and he's been in both public systems and been very successful in all of those. As you also know, he is a very important member of the State Board of Ed and former chair of the State Board of Ed. So with that, Jim, I will turn it over to you for any introductions and how we'll go about this morning. And Jim, I think you're muted right now.
There we go. Well, thank you, Randy, for those kind words. It is a great honor and privilege and giant responsibility to be the chair of this task force to look at graduation requirements. It's probably been over 117 years since there's been a comprehensive examination of Kansas graduation requirements. And I'd say it's long overdue. Your words are very important about, looking at new ways and seeing things that are happening around the country, which we will be doing. But today we have a packed agenda, that is going to keep us busy. And hopefully and my goal is that we'll be finished prior to 11 o'clock. I want to thank all the the members of the task force who have joined us today, as well as those who cannot join us right now, but will be with us later. It's important that we all have a voice, that we all have a commitment to the success of each student in the state of Kansas. So with that, what I'd like to do is we have over 40 people, I believe. I didn't look at the number in the last few minutes that are here, and it's tough for us to introduce ourselves and everyone in the time that we have. So we will be providing a way for us to introduce ourselves to each other. And with that, I'm going to introduce Jared Furman, who's the principal at Basehor Linwood and is the vice chair of this committee. Jared is a very successful high school principal right now in Basehor Linwood, and we're excited to have him on our task force. I have worked with him over the last several weeks, and I am very impressed with both his knowledge of schools and operations and his commitment towards the success of each student and the need for us to re-examine our graduation requirements. So with that, Jared, I'm going to turn it over to you, and let's do the introduction activity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jim, for that introduction. Excited to be here and to be a part of this team and take this charge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a quick Google form here in the chat box. And what I'd like for everyone to do is we're just going to take a couple minutes, 4 quick questions: your name, your title and location. What do you bring to the task force, and what do you want other task force members to know about you? And so we're going to try to keep to this time schedule. So if each of you would take just a minute or two to fill out that quick form, we'll make sure that we compile those and send those back to each of you, that you'll have access to that. So I posted that in the chat. Everyone should have access to that form. So I'll give you just a minute or two to fill those 4 questions out. Okay, about 1 more minute, and then we'll get moving on our agenda. Okay, Jim, I'm going to turn this back over to you. I appreciate everybody taking just a couple minutes to fill that out. And again, we'll compile those and get those back to you. Just very thankful to be a part of this group and excited to see how it's going how we're going to make a difference moving forward. So Jim, I'll turn it back over to you and we'll get going on the agenda.
Thank you, Jared. Hopefully we can all access those later in the morning and later today or at some time that's convenient to you. I want to say how important it is that we do access those and read about our participants. And in that particular case, I would hope that you would contact each other, sharing thoughts and ideas about graduation as we move forward. It's a different way of introducing ourselves. I do apologize. It is always a pleasure to hear from people who are on this about who they are and where they're serving. And I regret very much that we don't have that personal contact. But these are new times, and Zoom is a new way of meeting. There are advantages and disadvantages. With that, one of the things that I think is important for us as we begin is to have certain bits of information that will help us look forward. And one of the first things we need to do as we look forward is kind of return to the past. Where have we been? What has, how did we get where we are today? You know, and with that, I've asked Mark Tolman, Associate Executive Director of the Kansas Association of School Boards, to, excuse me, to give us a little background on an historical perspective on graduation requirements. Mark is a great friend, as KSB has been a great friend to the state board and to the state of Kansas. And we look forward to continuing our work with them. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can provide us the information that we need from a historical perspective on graduation requirements in Kansas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McNeese. You did not include in your introduction that among your distinguished teaching career was teaching me. So as we sometimes run into cases, I guess you can be judged or not judged by my presentation today. And my first task will be seeing whether I can make the program work here. Just a second. Okay. Mr. McNeese, as I still call him, asked me to do a little historical work and try to find out kind of how we got here. And one of the first unfortunate things I learned is that not everything is actually available on the internet. And so some of the things that I would like to be able to do, maybe specific to Kansas, we were not able to do. And we may keep looking. But one thing we were able to try to find out was the origins of the system we have now. And that's what I put together in a couple of these slides. Some of you educators probably remember this from your studies of education. Some of this was new to me, but there were really two things that created the national system that Kansas follows, like most other states do, well over 100 years ago. The famous Committee of 10, which was put together, actually part of the National Education Association, had a committee on secondary school studies that really gave the template that says high school should be 4 years of study following 8 years of elementary school and generally leading into 4 years of college. At the time, as we're going to see, this was not common at all, but that was the plan. And this commission recommended essentially the same course of studies for all, that basically a high school curriculum would have a defined set of courses. And one of the things they focused on was that they were very much organized around preparation for college. And the language that is quoted is really talking about you should teach the same thing in the same way as long as the student wants to learn it. And of course, at the time, as we can remember from our history, this was when the United States was beginning to enter the industrial age, a focus on standardization. Well, this tended to result in rather standardized high school curriculums across the country. And maybe not surprisingly, because a lot of the people on this commission were involved in colleges, it helped standardize teacher training. The other major development was the introduction of the Carnegie Unit, which was basically the idea that we would standardize teaching around 1 hour blocks of time, 5 days a week for a defined period of time that essentially gave us the system of everyone taking a class per class period every day during the school year. One of the things that's interesting is this became standardized in part because industrialist Andrew Carnegie helped endow a foundation that developed the college pension system that is still used today. And for colleges to participate in that pension system, they had to adopt the Carnegie Unit system. So once again, a very standardized way of looking at education at that time. And it really meant that for both secondary and post-secondary education, the system we've used for well over 100 years is primarily based on looking at blocks of time. It is worth noting, I think, that in 1900, less than 10% of the of the 17-year-old population of the country had completed high school. That's a different way of looking at a graduation rate that tells us when this was thought of as a good idea, most students were not going to high school. Even by 1940, the percent of the population going on to complete a 4-year degree was only 5%. Now, today, about 90% of the national and Kansas population who are adults have finished high school, and about 33 have a 4-year degree. Another 26% have some post-secondary education, not less than 4-year degree, but everything from technical certificates, 2 years degrees, or college without finishing any degree. So I guess what's in my mind interesting to note is we put in place a system with a lot of focus on preparation for college at a time when very few people went on to college or even finished high school. But over the past century, that has now changed dramatically. So Mr. McNeese asked me to look at the Kansas history, and the farthest back we've been able to find was that in 1980, a national report said, 1980, 2 years after I graduated from high school, the required state units were 17 total, without a breakdown of what those were. So I guess that's one thing to think of. Going back that period of time, the expectation was 17 of these Carnegie units. The next thing I wanted to note, some of you will remember, I still remember it because I was in college at the time, the Nation at Risk report that was commissioned and came out during President Reagan's first term was basically a finding that American education was failing. This is not the first time that that was found to be true, and not the last time, but it galvanized a lot of attention. There's kind of an interesting Kansas connection because the chair of that commission, Dr. Robert Hatterline, was the president of the National School Boards Association and a past president of KASB and a school board member in Girard, Kansas. The major focus of that group that could be measured was to call for minimum amount of what they called core academic studies. So I've listed them. I can't compare them to Kansas in 1980 because we didn't have them, and they did not recommend a total set of units, but they recommended 4 years of English, 3 years each of social studies, math, and science, half a year of computer science. Remember, this was 1983, and for college-bound students, 2 years of foreign language. By 1993, you can see that Kansas had increased its graduation requirements as far as total units from 17 to 21, still requiring three units of English, still social studies, not yet what was recommended in math and science, a year of physical education, and 9 electives. The next data we found was that in 2013, Kansas had still had the same requirement of 21 credits, but had increased the minimum requirements in math and science. And then if you can see on the screen, the current units are similar with the addition of fine arts, and I know you're going to hear more about that. I did want to mention one other thing, I guess, that has changed over time. Up until the early 1990s, which is when I started working at KASB, Kansas state law still made all state universities open admissions institutions, which basically said if you had a Kansas high school diploma, that was good enough to get into any institution. At that time, very controversial in the 1990s, the legislature changed that policy to say that after a phase-in, students must qualify based on some mixture of test scores, class rank, or completing a college preparatory curriculum with certain exception windows. Now, that only applied to the state universities, not community or technical colleges, which continued to be open admissions. Private colleges could set their own requirements. That has been modified somewhat, but most dramatically just this year, within the past year, the regions have changed that to set requirements based on test score or grade point average and made the college prep curriculum recommended, but no longer what would be considered a requirement. So another issue that you might find interesting is kind of how our requirements have been tied to time. Since 1993, when we adopted essentially the current school finance model, the minimum school term in Kansas was 186 days, or the hourly equivalent. That was increased in 1993 when the new school finance law was passed. The legislature added more money, and one of the kind of strings attached to that was to expect more time. Also, since that year, the basis of our funding system has been the number of students that you have. In other words, we count kids and how many hours each child is enrolled on September 20th, with the exception of a 2-year block grant system. So one of the consequences of this is students that would graduate a year early would no longer be counted in enrollment, or if you are enrolled in less than 6 hours a day, the school district does not get funding for that. So that creates certain incentives and disincentives. And this year, the legislature adopted new funding restrictions on remote learning. So Mr. McNeese graciously let me provide some final thoughts, and there are a couple I have. One is the fact that, for better or worse, this system was largely based on the idea of what it takes to prepare students for college, adopted at a time when a very small percentage of students attended high school and even fewer went on to college. And over at least the past 50 years, we've added to that. So I guess one of the things to ask is, well, how well has that system worked? What we do know is that high school participation has gone from a relatively small minority to an exception, and college attainment has gone from a very small percentage of the population to now having a third of the population with a 4-year degree, about 60% with some college, and evidence that about 2/3 to 3/4 of jobs will require some type of post-secondary education. All very different from when this system was adopted. Yet with these higher expectations, participation has increased. But a diploma alone does not mean college readiness. One of the issues we face that the legislature is now looking at, many students do not take college prep courses. They end up requiring remediation. Many who start post-secondary education do not finish, and we continue to hear concerns about a shortage of higher skilled workers coming from employers. We also know from information the state board has collected and other sources that most Kansan employers don't really seem concerned about how many units students have or the academic coursework they're taking as much as other skills that are not and have never really been explicitly part of Carnegie units, which are based on subject matter. So I guess in my mind, one of the first questions that I think you will get to in later discussion is, what does a high school diploma really mean or is expected to mean, and how do different elements, whether higher education, employers, or anyone else, really use the data we have right now? So that is my presentation. If there are questions, I can try to respond to them, if that's what the chair would wish, or move on with your discussion.
Mark, thank you very much for that presentation. I know it's a quick presentation with a lot of information, to be unpacked in there. The one response that I have right away is, over the past several years with the State Board of Education, we've done two significant things that I think impact our discussion and our thoughts as we go forward. About 5 or 6 years ago, we created a new vision that Kansas lead the world in the success of each student. And that's a powerful statement. It's a powerful challenge to us at the state board, but then translating it into the local schools, and does the diploma support that? And with that, we've also been pushing and challenging schools and mandating things. And one of those is the individual plan of study that we require for each student. And does the diploma and the graduation, as we've set it up today, do those things sync together? Are they working? And in our opinion at the state board, they do not. And that's what we're looking at. 20 years ago, it was an industrial society that was looking for efficiencies, that was looking for basically a sorting mechanism for students as they went through the educational system. It really wasn't designed for students, all students to graduate. And today we expect all students to graduate. And those are some very significant seismic changes in the landscape of our graduation requirements. At this time, we have a few minutes. We're a little bit ahead. So if you have questions, you can please put them in the chat box and Mark will address them. But we have a few minutes. If someone has a question out there they want to raise with Mark regarding this or make a statement, wave your hand, or we'll try to see if we can get you online. There's some 41 people out here.
Hey, Jim, one thing I will add real quick is at the end of our time today, we will have some small group discussion time. And so as you're listening to these presentations today, it'd be good to maybe take a few notes, jot down some things that you're thinking that would be really good for some small group discussion when we do our breakout rooms. So I just wanted to add that real quick.
Thank you, Jared. That's exactly, we'll have those opportunities.
I see a question from Matt, and I guess the response I would have is, what you are asking is what I was very interested in. What we found is much of that is not readily available. We have not yet been able to find whatever student wanted to do a massive research project on this. I think those are great questions. I can tell you it will probably take a lot of continued digging to try to get into the specifics of those, those things would have been put in place, and to find them, we're either going to have to find.
Mark, can you clarify the question?
I'm sorry?
Can you clarify the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was showing. The question was, look at regs, how over time we have changed specific requirements within subjects. So not just we require so many units of math, but algebra and geometry or basic statistics. And I think that was certainly also true within the qualified admissions look for colleges, was an expectation of particular courses. So I'm just kind of apologizing by saying we wanted to look at some of those things. We can continue to do so, but a lot of those decisions that may have been made in past years, we have not yet found readily available where those are. Um, Another question was definition of college prep in the eyes of KBOR. Yes, I think that may be part of what was presented in background or will be. There have been a few changes in that over the years, but I think it's just critical to understand that distinction in the 90s was basically to recognize that what we require of all students as a minimum is not necessarily designed to be what it takes to handle college level work, at least at some level. And I do think that is significant because one of the issues, and again, my work, if you don't know, is within the Kansas legislature. For many, there's an argument that says if you graduate from high school, you should be prepared for college. But I think the fact of a college prep curriculum suggests that most people agree what we now require as 3 years of math, for example, is not necessarily what colleges would say is necessary to do college level work. So that I think is right there a distinction. Do we believe that a high school diploma in and of itself, the minimum, should make you ready for college? I would say right now, at least operationally, that's not the expectation, but it creates a lot of frustration by some people.
Well, what I'd add, Mark, at this point is that the graduation requirements have ripple effects through many other activities and that support schools, as well as the master class schedule and building that with the electives, is a challenge to get all the things that we want to get there. And I've often said that on the master class schedule, each box on that master class schedule that you build has a cost factor. And that cost factor is the Carnegie units are the basis for pretty much the time and the days, that's how we count them, as how the legislature funds education. And that is a huge issue that we have to take into account. The funding formula that we use is solidly embedded in the Carnegie unit, in time, right now, in time and credits. I also note that local school districts have the option of increasing graduation requirements with local decisions. They can add, like in Wichita, for instance, they have added not just one American history course, but two. They've also, school districts have added computer studies. The board just changed the computer studies where you can substitute a computer science class in one of the science and math requirements. So there's a lot of little changes going on, but each of those have ramifications that are significant. The two I picked out are the masterclass schedule and having the opportunity for students to engage, but also as they engage, there's a dollar and cost factor. So those are others we'll be talking about as well. Mark, I want to thank you very much for your presentation. Your PowerPoint will be available for folks to look at and to respond to. And again, you can put your questions today or later on in the chat room, and Mark will respond to those. I appreciate very much the effort you put into this, Mark, and your presentation. Thank you. Our next person is one that we're all very familiar with. Dr. Watson will be providing an overview of the present Kansas graduation requirements and practices. So Randy, you're on, and thank you very much for joining us again.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you, Mark. It was really good. As Jim mentioned, and Ed's done this already, if you have questions related to Mark's presentation, please drop those in the chat, and Mark and others can be answering those even as I speak. And then my presentation and the Education Commission of the States, along with Mark, will formulate kind of your discussion background when you get into small groups a little bit later on today. I'm just going to kind of take you through a little micro examination of where Mark ended, which is the current state of graduation requirements in Kansas, and just walk you through what is currently in regulation, which bears the same effect as law. So jump into this. So these are the state board regulations, and we'll just walk through them as they are in regulation. Again, this is the minimum that every school district must have. So the first is every school shall have a written policy that basically determines what the graduation requirements are of that school district. And within that, as Mark mentioned, there has to be 4 units of English. And within those, which goes a little bit to Matt's question, it has to include reading, writing, literature, communication, and grammar within those 4 units. Maybe less known, I think most people would know that, maybe less known, is that the building administrator by the regulation can waive up to one of those units if they believe the pupil could profit more by taking another subject. That's sometimes done, taking something other than 4 units of credit. But in most schools, most students are completing 4 units of English language arts, which includes, again, as I mentioned, reading, writing, literature, communication, and grammar. It does not say, and it will include the study of Shakespeare, right? It doesn't say that. Now we're getting into curriculum. And one of the things that we'll be discussing a lot is the role of this task force and the role of the state board is to determine the specific areas to be studied, not the curriculum, which is a local decision in Kansas. 3 units of history and government, which shall include a study of world history, United States history, United States government, including the Constitution of the United States, economics, geometry, and of course you can see it. In addition is you need to have a course of instruction in Kansas history and government. In most Kansas school districts, most, not all, Kansas history is taught in the junior high or middle school grades, typically at 7th grade, but not always. That's typically where it's done. And world history is typically at the sophomore year, United States history the junior year, United States government, including Constitution, civics, economics, geography, at the senior year. It's not universal because nothing in this requirement says when you have to do it. That's just where most Kansas school districts teach the 3 units of what we would call social studies. By the way, I did drop this in the chat. All these are, so if you want to look at them when we go to discussion, you'll have those. And they'll also be readily available on the task force website. 3 units of science, which need to include a physical science, biological science, earth and space concepts. So the 3 units have to include those areas. And one of those must be a lab course. Science is done in a lot of different ways. Generally, that earth, space, and maybe a physical is the freshman year. Oftentimes, biology is the freshman or sophomore year, with the subsequent course being chemistry, and then generally a physics that may come after that. Now, that's a general sequence. Again, the requirements don't specify the sequence, just that there shall be 3 units. We'll talk about what a unit is in a second, and they must incorporate those ideas. Matt's direct question earlier, 3 units of math, and those units have to include algebraic and geometric concepts. They can include others, but they have to have those concepts. 1 unit of physical education, which also includes health. And you can see it's fine there. In statute, it specifically talks about the requirement can be waived for a few areas. Statement by a physician that says you're not physically or mentally capable of participating, or a statement by a custodian saying it's contrary to the religious beliefs of that student to engage in either the physical education or the health curriculum. This in general this part was put in at a time when many parents were concerned about courses around sex education that happened in the health curriculum, and thus the ability to waive out of those if they had a religious objection to that. One unit of fine art, broadly defined, as you can see there, art, music, dance, theater, forensics, and any other studies selected by a local board. So a lot of options for the local board to define what the unit of fine arts would be. 6 units of electives and a total of 21, as Mark said. Those are the graduation requirements across the state. Now, let me just add a couple of things within the statute. This is what Jim mentioned. Any local board can go above and beyond this, and most Kansas school districts do. Most Kansas school districts have some combination of more units of credit than 21, and many have additional courses. Financial literacy would be one of those that I mentioned earlier. Many school districts require a course in financial literacy, and many school districts might have 24, 25, 26 credits to be for requirement of graduation. And this will be important if we make any changes. Any changes to graduation in this reg or any time going forward can only occur for those entering 9th grade. So for example, if you said, we don't need a year to study this, we don't need a year, we can get this done in a month. We're going to get this done, and we're going to give it to the state board in July, and the state board can act on it in August. Well, if that were to occur, the earliest whatever you would deem to do or recommendations of the state board would only go into effect for the incoming class, freshman class this year. It would not affect anyone currently in high school. So that's just something to remember, and that's in statute, unless you have some recommendations that you want to change that. Now, as Mark talked about, what is the definition of a unit? And he did a really great job. Our definition is a measure of credit that's awarded when you satisfactorily complete a course or a subject. You say, we don't get into what does that mean to satisfactorily complete. So Jared at Baser Linwood, the staff at Baser Linwood are determining that when they pass a student or give them a certain grade. That's left locally to determine when that credit gets awarded. That makes sense. We don't determine when the credit gets awarded. That is a local decision that ensures that that student met that measure. And in fact, when you go to graduations, what generally the high school principal will say, or the superintendent, is that to the audience, that the Board of Education has certified that all students about to receive a diploma have met the graduation requirements as set forth in these statutes and the local Board of Education requirements. Now, this is interesting. Full unit credit is offered, generally requires 120 clock hours, and Mark did a really great job of talking about why that is. But what's occurred over time is we built a finance schedule and law around this system. And so when we get outside the system, oftentimes what you'll hear from school districts is it's hard to do because of the way students are funded. And finally, what's been in regulation now for a long time, and it's not used that often, individual students can be awarded credit upon demonstration and knowledge of the content of the course by the competency of it, regardless of the seat time. Regardless of the seat time. And Dave Younger, the superintendent Ulysses, is on this task force. And Ulysses has probably the most recognizable distinction a couple years ago of having a young man graduate from Harvard at about the same day he graduated from Ulysses High School. He obviously was doing both, and he was being awarded credit regardless of the amount of time that he was spending in a course, and it varied. This often happens for gifted students. It is less often to happen for non-gifted students, but it is an option for schools today. It's just not used as much as the unit of credit for seat time. I will stop that share. It is in the chat, um, as you see, and I would be happy, Mr. McNeese, to stand for any questions if they're in the chat, or if anyone has any related to the current requirements of Kansas schools.
Well, thank you, Randy. I'll jump in here with the first question, and others can certainly jump in following me as well as in the chat room, and you can respond to them because we certainly have, we're right on time. My question to you for clarification is the roles of the legislature and the state board. Okay, obviously the legislature has a say and the state board has a say. Whose say is what and who's more important? And as the local, so it's a legislature, state board, and local boards. Can you kind of define their power and responsibilities and authority?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do that. So at the time of unification, we can be called Bleeding Kansas for a lot of reasons. Generally, that's referred to the Civil War. For those that lived the unification, they may describe Kansas as reliving Bleeding Kansas because we went from thousands of school districts to several hundred. That occurred in the mid 1960s, and subsequently, the state of Kansas changed the Constitution of Kansas and said we weren't going to have a state superintendent. We were going to have a state board of education. And in the Constitution of Kansas, which is, by the way, you studied this in school. And remember, you had a course on this.
If you were in seventh grade in Kansas.
Yeah. The Constitution of Kansas says the state board shall have general supervision over the schools in Kansas. Subsequent court cases have defined that as being able to set the standards that we just talked about, the licensure of teachers, and the accreditation of schools, among other things. But certainly those are kind of the bullseye of the state board's responsibilities. And that local boards then had a responsibility for the implementation and the curriculum and how they were going to be graded and how they were going to be assigned. And you can see that in the way these graduation requirements were developed, fairly broad, giving a lot of control to the local school districts to do what they wanted to do. The second part of Jim's question, what's the role of the legislature? In our, it's very clear in the Constitution, it's to provide suitable finance for the vocational and academic interest of the state. That has been defined by the court in something called the Rose capacities, which lay out what those general vocational and academic interests are. So the Constitution of Kansas is very unique in that many state constitutions do not have a state board that is elected and given constitutional powers. It also gives local school districts some constitutional powers and the legislature. So that's why state board is convening this task force, is because the state board will be the one to set the graduation requirements upon the input, of course, of a broad-based number of people, including legislators that want input into that also.
Does the legislature have the authority to pass a law that would require students to pass a particular class or test?
Jim, we do not believe that they do. Of course, anything can be done, and that's why we have a court system that then determines, as the Supreme Court determined a free speech issue yesterday. But we believe that rests in combination with the state board and the local board. You can see that the state board never says to Seaman, here's how you grade. That's a local decision. That's a teacher decision. And you never see the state board dictating curriculum. Even when it says a course of mathematics, it leads that fairly broad. So Jim, it's we believe the Constitution says very clearly that that is not a legislative function as it was written in the Kansas Constitution.
Thank you, Randy. Again, if anyone has a question that they wish to ask at this particular time or to continue to use the chat box, that would be fine.
And I appreciate Brad for jumping in there. And we have some other state agency people that are serving here as support for you, including several people. So they will also jump in the chat. Feel free, David and Jay and Doug and everyone, to help answer the questions as we go forward.
Hey, Randy.
Yes, Brad.
I don't know how much it pertains, but to this question, the only exception 21 credits. If the school district offer or requires 25, for example, there is a statute that says if a foster student comes possibly their senior year and they've met the 21, then you need to give them a high school diploma and not hold them back because you have something unique in your district. So that's the only exception to the, you can set 25 and require it, but if it's a foster care student and they've met the state's 21 and they need a high school diploma, there is a statute that says you need to give it to them. But
thank you, Brad, for reminding us of that. And the reason for that is the transient nature of many foster care kids between different systems. I would also say that the pandemic caused several Kansas school districts that had a higher graduation course total or credit total to alter that in some cases and go with the states because of the disruption. Not everyone did that, but we had some number of Kansas school districts that did that.
And Randy, I asked one question here, it has kind of several layers. One is time. For funding purposes, a student enters and has 4 years or 8 semesters to graduate under the funding formula. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. We also have
now, Jim, they can be funded past that 4 years if they have not received a high school diploma. And oftentimes school people will know that when we're dealing with maybe some special ed students that are more severely handicapped, they will go into a program that we commonly call the 18 to 21 or a transition program. And those students don't graduate at that time, but they wait and graduate at age 21. But for example, if someone did not graduate at Kansas High School and came back to Goddard High School at age 42, they would be funded until they got their high school diploma. Once the high school diploma is issued, the funding then ceases under Kansas law.
Thank you for clarifying that. Any other questions?
Colin had a good question about where did the independent plan of requirement come from? Who sets the standards? It is not in the graduation requirements, Colleen. It is the state board requirement through accreditation of schools that every student starting at a minimum of 8th grade shall have an individual plan of study that guides their studies in high school and then in whatever they're going to do afterwards. But that was never put into the graduation requirements. It was put into in order to be an accredited school in Kansas. And I hope that clarified that. It's a great question.
Very good. Yes.
I'll be happy to set and answer questions if there are more in the chat, Mr. McNeese. Again, I dropped the the PowerPoint in the chat in case you wanted to use it when you go to breakout sessions. But I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Randy. Excellent presentation. As we move forward, one of the things that's interesting isn't just that local districts here in Kansas can add more courses to be required for graduation. And there's this division of authority and power between the legislature and the state board and local boards. Well, not all states do it the same way. I think there are only 6 states that actually function under the premise of a constitutionally established state board of education. All the rest are either they could be created by the legislature. Some meet only every other year. There's all kinds of different configurations, but one of the things that's very different is the national perspective. We're very much the same, but we're also very different, So what I've asked is that the Education Commission of the States, which is we refer to as ECS, is a supportive agency that works with the state boards and legislatures and governors across the nation, and providing research and providing support and information that helps them do their jobs better. I have worked with the ECS, and quite frankly, I'm also on their board of directors. So I have, and Jared and I and Randy have used ECS quite extensively in the past, but especially in this particular endeavor. So I have asked Joel Moore, who's our regional support person for ECS for Kansas, and Brian Kelly, who's a researcher with ECS, to present information to us about the national perspective on and trends in state graduation requirements. So Joel and Brian, I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. And thanks to Dr. Watson and Jared for having us. And thank everybody on the task force for your time, energy, and perspective that you're bringing to the conversation. So as Jim mentioned, my name is Joel Moore, and I'm proud to serve as ECS's liaison to the policymakers in Kansas. And before we get started, Jim touched on a lot of this, but I wanted to share a little bit about ECS. We are a national, nonpartisan, non-advocacy education policy center. We were founded about 60 years ago by the states through an interstate compact with the purpose of helping education policymakers learn from one another, hear about other states and how they're approaching solutions, and develop more informed policy for their home states. So we work with governor's offices, state departments, state boards, higher education agencies, legislatures, and their staffs, because we know that more informed policymakers will create better education policy. So how we do this is through the efforts of an amazing policy team who are constantly monitoring, reviewing, and tracking state policy actions, whether it's legislation or a department or governor initiative or a state board initiative. And we use this information to release 4 to 6 reports each month. Those are all free and available and searchable by you on our website, ecs.org. Some of those resources are included on the agenda page that was shared with you in advance of this meeting. And outside of this context, we are always available to look into any state policy questions you might have. And if we don't have an immediate answer for you, we're happy to get a written response to you in about 72 hours. So always feel free to reach out to me directly at jmoore@ecs.org. I'll drop that in the chat, and I'm happy to facilitate that answer for you. So again, we're a nonpartisan organization and don't advocate for any particular policy. We don't tell you what's right for Kansas. You know your state the best. We can't tell you what 49 other states are doing. So thanks for having us again today. With all that said, I'm happy to introduce Brian Kelly, who's a policy researcher with our team, to lead you through the national background and trends on graduation requirements that we're seeing around the country. So Brian.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. And thank you all for having me to come speak with you all. I'm excited to go through sort of share the national perspective, give a decent number of state examples for you all to consider as you're thinking about what would be best for Kansas. So I will just get started on the next slide here. Yeah, so I'll just set and let you know where I'm going to go, try to do a roadmap for the presentation. So first off, I'm going to give a national landscape of graduation requirements. And it's important to note that this information, a lot of this information I'm going to be giving you, comes from a 50-state comparison resource that ECS has available on our website. I know it's part of the agenda that was sent out to you all, and then it's also, you can click at the agenda on the website that was provided for this presentation in particular. But this has a range of information on graduation requirements throughout the states in DC. It was last updated in 2019. So some of the examples I give might be slightly outdated, but I still think that they are a very useful model, an example of what graduation requirements can look like. And also on the 50-state comparison that we have, we include citations that show you where in statute and regulation this information is coming from. So it's a very good resource to be able to go back in and check and see exactly how this information was drawn up by the states. So after giving a national landscape, I'm going to give a brief overview of COVID-19 disruptions and waivers. I know that this is certainly no news to anyone on this call, that the COVID-19 pandemic caused a lot of disruption with education policy and education systems, and graduation requirements certainly falls into that camp. States across the country had to figure out how they could scramble a bit and make adjustments or perhaps waivers to requirements so that students who were going through the high school system could still have decent expectations on what was required of them to graduate. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up by looking at some recent trends. This is specific to legislative activity, but from 2019 to 2021, we've compiled the legislation that's been passed in states throughout the country, and we'll be providing some examples that you can dig into for very recent highlights on what's on the agenda for many states throughout the country. So to begin, I'll start by just giving a national overview. Again, there's a large range of differences across the state, and there's a number of ways of comparing how these states approach the graduation requirements question. So there's a number of components I'm going to walk through, and I'll provide you with the range of the lower scale and the higher scale, provide some state examples to show you what it looks like on the ground. So the first one is quite straightforward, just units required. And I'm very happy that Dr. Watson and Mr. Tallman were able to speak more specifically about the situation in Kansas and the significance of a unit. I think that'll be important context to go into this conversation, looking at how other states approach. Next, we'll look at state-specified minimums. And again, there's already been good conversation about the question of states setting the minimum and then district levels being able to supplement that. We'll look at some variation within that. Next, we can look at non-course requirements. So outside of actual classes being taken, many states have non-course requirements for graduation. And then finally, we'll look at alternate diploma types. So this is alternative setups, so there's a little bit more variation and customization available to students who are graduating from high school. So we'll start by looking at units. Again, this is quite straightforward, simply a numerical question. Throughout the states, there's a large range of these total units, from 13 on the low end to 24 on the high end. So just to provide you an example of what this looks like, we can look at Alaska, where there are 13 units that are required. And just to, again, I'm very happy that Mark Tallman was able to show you what the subject specifics were within Kansas. So along similar means, in Alaska, we have 4 English credits, 3 math credits, 3 social studies credits, 1 PE and health credit. And then within this, so these 13 are the sole enumerated subject-specific credits. Overall, there are 21 units of credit must be taken for students to graduate in general at the broad sense. But these 13 units are those that are prescribed and numbered specifically in statute and regulation. So Alaska's on the lower end. And again, it seems like this might have been around the number that Kansas had back in the 80s. It's good to have that historical perspective. On the other side of that scale, we can look at the District of Columbia, which has 24 required units. And this gets a bit more specific. 4 English units, 4 math units. This includes Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2. 4 Social Studies units. This includes World History 1 and 2, US History, US Government, and DC History. Some of these are for a fraction of a unit, which makes sense why that would add up to more than 4 otherwise. Science, there are 4 required units, including 3 lab sciences, and this also includes biology, 1.5 PE and health units, 1 art unit. Half of this art unit must be an art class, and the other, another 0.5 must be a music course, 2 foreign language units, and 3.5 elective units. So again, just to give you a sense of the variation on the overall broad requirements within these states. Next, we can look at state specified minimums. And again, this is largely a question of jurisdiction. So the overwhelming majority of states, 48 states in DC, have minimum statewide high school graduation requirements, meaning that the state level is where these requirements are set. So again, districts can supplement and districts can add on throughout many of these jurisdictions, but generally the primary arbiter of this is the state level. And there are 2 interesting exceptions to this, where in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, these states largely defer down to local districts to set what the graduation requirements are. And then it's worth noting that until very recently, the state of Colorado also was in this bottom camp where it was more of a local decision, but Colorado has quite recently joined the majority and now largely set that at the state level. Then we can look at non-course requirements. So again, we've gone through, math, science, those very specific classes that must be taken, but at least 17 states specify some non-course requirements as a condition of graduation. So to give you some examples, this one is very straightforward. We can look at Florida, where in addition to the credits and the other minimum graduation requirements that the state has in place, Florida requires that students have a minimum 2.0 GPA on a 4.0 scale for high school graduation. And then a little bit more complicated than that, we can look at Idaho, where by the end of grade 11, students must complete a college entrance exam. So this is probably going to be an SAT or an ACT. And then in addition to that, by the end of grade 12, students must complete a senior project with a written report and oral presentation. So again, this is showing a bit more the skills-based passage that the state is looking for. And then finally, we can look at alternate diploma types. At least 18 states offer some sort of alternative to just the general diploma. And I'll give you a couple of examples you can consider. One comes from the state of Mississippi, which has a traditional diploma. So this is something that all students must do this minimum. So it's 24 credit minimum set in place to get the traditional standard Mississippi high school diploma. But in addition to this, students can take additional courses in order to add one of several different endorsements so that their diploma says a bit more than just the traditional diploma. So this could be an endorsement that is academic, that is distinguished academic, that is dedicated to career and technical education, or a seal of biliteracy. So this just allows a bit more customization and specification for graduating students in the state. Another example we can look to comes from the state of Louisiana. So there are 2 general types I'll talk about. One is the university diploma, 24 specified units. And again, you can see in the language that's used here, that seems to be made with the thought that university will be in this student's future, as we were seeing some of the language with the foundation of the Kansas requirements. So there's the university diploma, which is 24 specified units. We can see a list of the subject matter that those are tied to. But in addition to that, there's also a career diploma, which has 14 specified units. So those 14 units will overlap quite a lot with the basic university diploma. But in addition to those 14 specified units, there's 9 required courses in Jumpstart course sequence, workplace experiences, and approved credentials to be taken. And in addition to those, a minimum of 1 industry-based credential is required for graduation. So again, you can see some of the intent that is more career-focused rather than university-focused, perhaps, for those graduating students. And then another interesting aspect of Louisiana policy is that for both of those different diploma types and career or graduation tracks, students must require the FAFSA in order to graduate. So another consideration. So I know that I've just gone through a lot of examples. And again, I invite you to look at the 50-state comparison. There's quite a lot of really good information there. But now I'm going to turn and look at some more recent developments, specifically tied to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the alterations and waivers that this prompted throughout the country to give an understanding of how things might be looking a little bit different, at the very least for the prior year and perhaps for this year. So we've seen a number of trends or categories that these COVID alterations have fit into. The first being waiving of non-course graduation requirements. And I'll give you an example of each of these different components that we've seen. Second, we've seen a decent amount of waiving, delaying, or providing flexibility for end of course or end of year assessments. I'm sure that you all are familiar with how this has looked in your own state. And then third, there's been a decent amount of activity authorizing local authorities to determine if students are able to graduate and to dispense those diplomas. So just to give you some specific examples, this one is quite straightforward. In the District of Columbia, there is generally a graduation requirement that students must complete a certain number of volunteer community service hours. That was obviously complicated quite a lot because it's COVID-19 pandemic. So there was a waiver and then an extension of this waiver to this requirement, specifically tied to the time in which COVID-19 pandemic was altering the situation. Second, we look at Pennsylvania. This is an example of a state altering assessment requirements because of COVID. So within the Keystone State, there are generally Keystone exams, but a Senate bill enacted last year delayed the administration of these Keystone exams as a graduation requirement. And then it also allowed for the completion of a course in a particular topic that's associated with the Keystone exam. It allows that course to be used in lieu of the exam. And then one final interesting point of this bill, I think, was that it was not only true for the 2019 to 2020 school year, for instance, but the new regulations were set in place for all subsequent school years in which the federal government waives testing and accountability requirements. So it's acknowledging the other player behind a lot of this, which is the federal government, and any requirements or waivers to requirements that the federal government puts in place. The federal action triggers the state action in this sense for Pennsylvania. And then finally, one example of a graduation requirements being moved down to a more local decision comes from the state of Ohio, which in 2021, so this year, enacted a House bill that permits school districts, other public schools, or chartered non-public schools to allow the principal, in consultation with teachers and counselors, to grant diplomas for those on track. So the principal, in consultation with those others who might be more familiar with the specific circumstances of the student, is able to determine whether or not that student has successfully completed the high school curriculum or individualized education program, and then bestow that diploma. So again, I know that there's a number of examples that I've been giving. I believe that also in the agenda, there was a link to a resource that ECS has on our website that's available to you all on the COVID-19 adjustments to graduation requirements. So next I'm going to be finishing up this presentation by talking about recent trends. So looking specifically to bills that have been passed from 2019 to the present that give us a sense of what's been going on. And actually, Joel, if you're able to, I'll ask Joel to put in the chat just a link to a resource that has more information that I'll be providing here, and then also provides the full range of states and bills that we have seen acting in this area, so you can dig around at your own time and learn a bit more about these examples. But so overall, between 2019 and 2021, there have been at least 29 graduation requirement bills enacted across 18 states. So it's been an area of decent movement, even prior to COVID-19 pandemic. And we've taken about 4 larger trends that we've seen within these 29 bills. And so I'll provide again an overview and then an example of states implementing each of these different trends. But one is states requiring civics courses prior to graduation, or along a similar line of thought, requiring that students take the US naturalization test and maybe receive a certain score on that. Next, we can see a lot of interest in encouraging computer science and STEM credits. And I know that Dr. Watson mentioned this line of thought applied in Kansas regulations. But yeah, being able to take either a computer science or a STEM course, and then using that to substitute for a graduation requirement as a way to facilitate more students taking those courses. Third, we'll look at new graduation pathways. This has been an area of a decent amount of interest in providing more than one pathway through high school for students. And then finally, again, an encouragement of financial literacy courses, and in some cases, a requirement of either financial literacy courses or along sort of a parallel line of thought, requirement of the FAFSA being completed for graduation. So just to fairly quickly go through one example of each of these different types that we've seen, we can look to the state of Oklahoma for civics and naturalization tests. This is specific to the naturalization test. So this year, HB 2030 was passed and enacted, and it creates a naturalization test graduation requirement. This will begin in the 2022-2023 school year and will be part of the US history assessment. So in order to graduate, students must have completed this test. Second, for an example of computer science courses being used, we can look at Alabama. So in 2019, HB 216 allowed the use of computer science courses. Taking a computer science course in high school can be seen as the equivalent of a math course or science course for the purposes of high school graduation requirements. And then I think that this Alabama bill is quite interesting because sort of the chat activity prior to this made me think of how high school graduation requirements can be tied to expectations or requirements for higher education admissions. So in Alabama, this bill, in addition to allowing the substitution of these credits, it also allows computer science courses to satisfy math or science first-year admission requirements for public higher ed institutions that are in the state of Alabama. So it's really got a two-pronged implication for students, both at the high school level and then potentially at the higher education level as well. Then new graduation pathways. Washington is an example of a state implementing this sort of policy. In 2019, a bill was passed to, beginning a 1-year delay, a requirement that to graduate, high school students need to follow at least one of 8 different graduation pathways. So that means completing at least one of 8 different requirements in order to graduate with one certain type of pathway to be able to talk about. So to get a sense of the intent behind this, from the bill, this is a quote from there, pathways are meant to provide a meaningful high school diploma that is tailored to the goals of the student. So allowing a little bit more sense of customization and personalization. So there's 8, and I'm not going to go through all of them because that would make for a boring presentation. But just to give you a sense of the range and the scale of what these include, I just included a few of them. So pathways might include taking the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. It could include taking a career and technical education or CTE course sequence, taking a college admission exam and then receiving a certain threshold score there, taking a certain number of dual credit courses, and that could also include advanced placement or international baccalaureate courses, or taking a statewide assessment and again, achieving some threshold score there. And I think an interesting note to go along with this Washington policy is that, as you can probably imagine, having a new policy with 8 different options, even me explaining it can be a little bit confusing. So Washington has made a good amount of guidance documents or one-pagers or data visualizations to be able to communicate what these different graduation pathways might look like to both the students and to the families of the students, and then of course those administering the education that the students will be taking along on these pathways. So that can be worth a look at their website if that's of interest. And then finally, we'll look at Arizona. This is an example of financial literacy credit being required. So in 2019, a bill was passed and enacted that created a requirement for at least half of a course credit in economics. And then specific to that, there's the requirement that this course must include components of financial literacy and personal financial management. So again, showing that, that emphasis from the policymakers in the state of Arizona. So thank you very much for giving me your time today. I know, again, that I've been through a lot of examples. I know that a recording is being made available of this presentation. And again, as I've said, ECS has a great number of resources available on graduation requirements. Primarily, I think the 50-state comparison really is a great one-stop shop to consider how different states approach these questions. But beyond that, myself and Joel, the Kansas State liaison, we're both very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Here's our contact information, so please feel free to send us a question, or I think I've been seeing some chat notifications pop up. I haven't been able to read them. So we're also happy to answer your questions here. Maybe if there are any, if somebody could feed them to me, I appreciate that. Thank you.
So far, so good, Brian. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian and Joel, for that presentation. We have a few minutes. Brian, if you want to respond to some of the chat box questions.
I think
Yeah, so-
sorry,
Go ahead, Joel.
I was going to say, Jay Scott shared the IPS rubric for reference. And then Betty Arnold asks, is more information available on graduation pathways? Let me see what we have.
I would be happy to, so specific to the Washington example of graduation pathways, I'd be very happy to drop in the chat the Washington website that contains sort of explainers of that. And then also I can put in a link to the enacted bill that created those graduation pathways. And then of course, if you have any additional questions beyond that, you can feel free to send me or Joel an email and we can get more information back to you.
Brian, for your information, as well as for the task force, Washington is one of the states that we're going to have a presentation from at our next meeting. So excellent. Thank you for previewing that. Any other questions? Seeing none. Again, thank you, Brian and Joel and ECS for your support and help in organizing the task force, as well as presenting information today that will help us understand what's going on around the nation. It is always surprising to me, the variability of all the different things that happen in states, but also the commonalities, you know, the Carnegie unit time, you know, and that we are, in fact, as states, trying to look at new things and new ways to respond to the economies of today and to the realities of the future these students are facing. So again, thank you for your information. And I want to, at this particular point, move to our next, which is small group conversations and reflections. And what I'd like to say to everyone is thank you for bearing with us. This has been, you know, over an hour of information being provided to you. Not the best way to start off a task force necessarily, to get you feel engaged and purposeful, but background information that will be important to us as we move forward, setting the stage for future conversations. So at this particular point, this is where you do get a chance to have some conversations and reflections. And I'm going to turn it over to Jared, who will lead the small groups and set you up into that. So Jared, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And thanks again to Brian and Joel for that presentation. Really appreciate all that information and all the help that you're going to provide this task force. So like Jim said, that was a lot of information that we threw at everybody. And I think it's very important for each of us to have some discussions and be able to share some of those thoughts. So I'm going to thank our 3 facilitators, and then I'm going to thank Peggy Hill also. She has already placed each of you in breakout rooms. And so here, as soon as I kind of explain what we're going to do, she's going to send you out into outer space, into your breakout rooms. We have 3 wonderful facilitators that are going to help those conversations. Melanie Haas, Betty Arnold, and Jean Clifford are going to lead those discussions. And you can see here, this is what it's going to look like. So we're going to take the first 4 or 5 minutes. You're going to get about 15 minutes in your breakout room. You're going to take the first 4 or 5 minutes to answer these 3 questions. So, and then that's what your discussion will be for the next for the following 10 minutes. I think it's very important, and I know Joel has really helped us with this, that we want to capture all of your thoughts. And so we will share all of these with from each group with each member of the task force, and because it's important to keep those and to have some of those conversations. So this is a very simple process. You're going to click on here, type in your answer, hit the check mark, and everyone in your breakout room will be able to see what you're writing. The 3 facilitators will share this link with you when you break into your breakout rooms. When we come back, or before we come back, you will see a timer that will tell you there's 1 minute remaining. When we come back to the full group, we will have each facilitator will share just a short little summary of your conversations. And then again, we will make sure that you have access to all these conversations afterwards. Joel's going to compile those for us and make sure we can get those. So Peggy, I think we're ready. If you want to get everybody into, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If you want to send everybody to their chat rooms, and we'll go from there.
I hit go.
Well, hopefully everyone had some pretty productive conversations and an opportunity to kind of just kind of reflect a little bit. Again, we will compile all of those and all those notes that you took, and we will share those with the group. And we'll try to get some of those questions answered. And then for Jim and I, as we continue to work on agendas, those questions will help drive our conversations that we have. So we're going to do a quick share out for our three facilitators. So Melanie, do you want to go first and talk a little bit about, just give us a minute or so of maybe what you discussed in your group?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a whirlwind, not very much time in there. But one of the things that we really hit on was that seat time requirement. It came up in a couple of different ways, but just the seat time does not equate to success. And then I think that there was a lot of interest in the multiple pathways to graduation that were described in other states. There was definitely some surprise and intrigue there. And so it's nice to know that we have, some opportunities to do things in a different way. And then, of course, as we think about what those different ways look like, there's certainly a concern about acceptance and, acceptance of change, and what it will look like to roll out new requirements is going to be potentially challenging for communities, for parents, for students. And then even for some of, if you look at what colleges are going to look to when we're talking about getting into whatever your post-secondary step may be, what kinds of metrics do they want to see? What are their expectations, and how do we change those expectations? And then finally, I just want to hit on a comment that we had towards the end with regards to redesign. There's already been a lot of great work done on these topics, kind of in different ways. And so we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to look back at some of those conversations that have already happened as part of the redesign project. So yeah, that's us in a minute.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Jean, you want to talk about the group that we were in?
Yes, I'd be happy to. We talked about what we want a diploma to mean, and what the various range of minimum credits that were across the states. That was kind of a comment, and what students really need to gain from high schools to be successful in life, and how we can change our system to make that happen, as well as what we will need to do and need to know to make those changes. One of the things that was brought up that we didn't talk about as much is equity, but that will certainly be a concern for the future of our discussions, and how we can make these changes without having an impact on funding or graduation rates or AA eligibility, and how much buy-in we will need from school districts to really take advantage of this and personalize it for the students in the system. So thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Okay, Betty, and you had group 3. Do you want to share some thoughts that you guys had?
Well, I do. First of all, starting out, we need more time. By the time we got our questions typed in, and did not have a lot of time to discuss each question, so I'm just going to focus on the first 2. It seemed like there was a consensus that education really should mirror the industry, and which is a great segue as our commissioner gets ready to start on his tour once again of trying to make sure we're doing that we're preparing the workforce for the future. The other area that I really thought was interesting that was added in was being able to advocate for students in terms of graduation requirements. I personally was excited about looking into the possibility of alternative pathways. And, but again, going forward, I think that for this to be meaningful, we really need to look at a little more time to give the group participants an opportunity to share. That's always been my personal concern, is that when it's time for us to come together with our ideas, it is rushed. I do think some of the best ideas would come from small groups, and I had an impressive array of people that participated, so I was very appreciative of that. But ideas really tend to fall right in line with group 1 and 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. And Jim, I think we make note of that for our next couple of meetings, that maybe that small group discussion that needs to be a little bit bigger time. So I think thank you, Betty, for sharing that. And that's good input as we move forward. So thank you, everybody. We'll make sure we get that information to you. I'm going to turn it back over to Jim to kind of get us, wind us down here.
Well, thank you, Jared, and thank you all for your patience today with the presentations. The kickoff meeting is always, and when you bring the historical perspective and 50 states, it can get a little dry. And there's this, hopefully, you've all been asked to be on the task force because of your voice. What you bring to us and what you have to say, we need to listen to. So yes, we'll listen well. And as Betty asked us, we will have more time for conversation and amongst ourselves, and more times to share that conversation with the rest of the group. I think that's very important. Some other issues that I heard come up, with the term equity. We have yet to dive into the numbers and dive into what populations are underserved by our graduation program requirements that we have right now. So that's a big part, as well as stakeholders. There are many stakeholders, whether it's the Activities Association directly as students are in school, or colleges and universities, business and industry. These are all groups that we need to look at as important ones. And certainly the one I wouldn't want to leave out are parents. Whatever we come up with has to be understandable, manageable, and accepted by parents and communities. The larger state itself is going to be a big voice in what we do. Well, as we transition now, we're Jared and I have been very cognizant of to value your time. So I'm going to just say right now, upcoming task force meetings. We're looking at our next meeting on July 8th, and then a meeting following that on July 22nd. But you can certainly scratch from your plans the 5th and the 12th, because the school is starting, and many of you are involved with the startup of school, and that's very important. So we're not going to have a meeting on the 5th or the 12th, but we are looking at the 19th and September 2nd. So as we look forward, just some things to think about. We will be in touch with you about any upcoming changes or anything that might impact our calendar. You will be able to access the website, and Peggy will be getting that out to you, where to find that for the handouts, notes, and material relevant to our work. That'll include a fact sheet, a description of task force charge and responsibilities. Well, first, let me say this. I want to thank everyone very much for their patience and their attention. And I want to thank our presenters today, Mark and Randy and Joel and Brian, for what they've done to bring us up to date. And we all have the same information. That's great. Please send any comments, concerns, or questions or ideas to either Jared or I. We're happy to hear from you. This is not going to work well if all our meetings are like this. We need to get you involved. We need to hear your voice. We need to hear your questions, comments, and concerns, and thoughts about graduation requirements moving forward. So thank you very much. So with that, any last comments, Jared?
Just a couple questions. Yeah, we'll send out, Brad, the calendar invites for those meeting dates and times. And then Colleen, we will compile all of those questions and things from the breakout groups, and we'll work on getting answers. Absolutely.
Yes, thank you. So with that, again, thank you to everyone, the task force members, to our presenters, and to all the support folks that went into making this meeting happen. The goals that we had, one of being finished before 11 o'clock, we're here, but we have got a lot of information to sift through and to respond to, and you will be hearing from us shortly. So thank you all for being here today. And with that, I will close the meeting of the Graduation Task Force for the state of Kansas. Thank you.